The Irish Famine of the late 1840s was the single most catastrophic event in the country's history. It caused 1 million deaths and forced another 1 million people to emigrate, leaving their ruined homes behind them. It changed Ireland forever and cast a shadow over the country for the next 150 years. Even today there are statues and memorials all across Ireland. The famine also had a profound effect on other countries like America, Canada, Australia and the UK because of the mass migration it caused. In America alone, 40 million people claim Irish heritage, many of them descended from victims of the famine. On one level, the famine was caused by the failure of the potato crop, but most historians now agree that the resulting tragedy was largely man-made because of government incompetence and even willful neglect. Some officials at the time even regarded the famine as God's way of getting rid of excess population. Many people now describe the government's approach at the time as genocide, creating the Irish Holocaust. There have been several failures of the potato crop in Ireland in the 17th and 18th centuries, which led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. However, the period now referred to as the famine, or the Great Hunger, and Gorta Mór in Irish, began in September 1845. There had been warning signs since June that year, when the potato crop in Belgium and other European countries was found to be infected with a strange new blight, which we now know as Phytophthora infestans. It reduced healthy potatoes to a stinking, inedible pulp. In Europe, the crop failure was a serious but manageable problem. In Ireland, it was a disaster on an unprecedented scale. There were two main reasons why the Irish suffered so much more than people on the continent. First, for historical reasons, more than 2 million Irish labourers and their families were totally dependent on the potato to survive. This was a much higher proportion than in other countries. Second, the British government at the time was not prepared to fund famine relief and follow the steps taken in mainland Europe to prevent mass starvation. The reason so many Irish poor relied on the potato was due to the issue of land ownership. The English conquest of Ireland meant that most of the best land was in the hands of wealthy landlords, many of whom were either English or of English descent. Many of them were known as absentee landlords because they didn't even live in Ireland. Most of these people, even those who did live in Ireland, still regarded themselves as English and had little empathy with the native Irish. They owned most of the best land, and their main concern was to make a profit from cash crops like wheat or by raising cattle. The Irish were confined to the less fertile land. Their small holdings were divided up between sons over the generations, so that by the 1840s, most of Ireland's poor depended almost entirely on what they could grow on small plots of second-rate land. Some of these plots were little more than an acre. The only crop that could provide enough food to support a family on such small plots was the potato. By the 1840s, more than 2 million people depended on it as their life support system. Even when times were good, they struggled to survive. If the crop failed, they knew they faced starvation. The reason the government failed to provide sufficient famine relief was due to political and economic philosophy, and perhaps a little religious prejudice. When the famine first struck in 1845, the British government was headed by Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel. He had experienced crop failures in Ireland before and set about importing grain from abroad to help feed the starving. He also started to set up public works projects so the poor would have a way to earn money to buy food. Unfortunately for the Irish, Peel lost the 1846 election and the Whig Party, led by Lord John Russell, came into power. The Whigs believed in the free market and opposed anything that would upset trade. They were also evangelical Protestants with little respect for Irish Catholics. Some regarded Ireland as a backward country with an idle population and outdated farming systems. Charles Trevelyan, the man responsible for organising famine relief in Ireland, even went so far as to say that the famine was God's way of punishing the Irish and weeding out excess population. Taken together, these views had disastrous consequences for the Irish poor because it meant the way the British government handled the crisis was in stark contrast to how governments in the rest of Europe reacted. For example, when the potato crop failed in Belgium, the government there stopped the export of food products such as grain and livestock. The British government was urged to do the same, but it refused on the grounds that banning food exports would interrupt free trade and be bad for the economy. The result was that as the poor starved, millions of tons of grain and livestock that could have been used to feed them was instead shipped abroad to be sold for profit, mainly in England. Historians disagree about whether or not the food that was exported would have been enough to have prevented the famine entirely, but most believe that it would have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The potato crop didn't fail in 1847, but that was of little help as the poor had been forced to eat their seed potatoes over the previous year, and so hardly any crops had been sown. Nevertheless, the government declared the famine to be over and stopped relief and works programs. It was forced to relent over the following years as the crops continued to fail and the death toll mounted. It set up soup kitchens, which did succeed in saving many lives. It also introduced more works programs, but they were poorly organised and largely ineffective. The potato crop continued to fail in varying degrees until 1851. There were more failures afterwards, but the worst period, the one referred to as the Great Famine, occurred between 1845 and 1851. During that period, an estimated 1 million people died of starvation or famine-related diseases such as typhus and dysentery. 1 million more emigrated during or immediately after the famine years. Ireland was left devastated. It lost a quarter of its population in the space of 6 years. The famine, its causes and consequences are still widely researched and debated today, and it still evokes an emotional response among Irish people and among those of Irish descent whose ancestors were forced to emigrate to countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia and the UK.